project surface is a half moon door crown. This is about 13 and a half inches wide, and I'll give you the source in the printed materials. And to prepare this, I have applied a generous coat of the DecoArt Traditions multi-purpose sealer to all the sides of it. So you have to do this in stages. I did the front and edges and then let that dry and then turned it over and did the back. And then after it's all dry, I just sanded it with a little sanding pad, one of these little oval pads that's a real fine grain, and just took down the nap of the grain that was raised so it's smooth again. And base coat this, we're going to base coat it in white. And for this project, I'm going to try the new chalky finish paints by DecoArt. They're called Americana Decor Chalky Finish. And this color's Everlasting, which is a white. You know, if you don't have the chalky paints, just use any white paint. You can use like DecoArt Americana Snow White or Titanium White, or the Traditions Titanium White or Opaque White. But for a background, these nice big jars make it easy to base coat a big surface. So I've just opened this bottle for the first time, or jar for the first time, so the lid was a little sealed. And I'm just going to use a large flat brush. This is a 3/4 inch, or if you want to use a sponge brush or whatever. And I'm just going to apply a coat of this over the entire surface. You can do the back if you want, but for the moment I'm just going to do the top and edges. I'm going to let that dry and probably apply a second coat. So work up to that point and then we'll come back with the next step. One thing I was going to show you as I'm base coating this, I've got just a coat over the whole surface, but you can see this chalky finish paint leaves kind of brush strokes. Not sure if you can see that or not, but I'm seeing a lot of little brush strokes in it. So it's staying wet for a little while. So what I'm doing is, after I've got the whole surface covered, I'm just starting and working from one edge to the other and just pulling long straight strokes following the grain of the wood to eliminate those little brush strokes that are in the middle and get a more even coat. Once this dries, I'm definitely going to add a second coat to this, just so I have a nice white background. And then once that dries, we're going to come back and paint it again, but we're going to do some variegated background with some of the whites and grays. My board now has 2 or 3 coats of the white chalky finish paint on it, and I've done the edges and the top. I haven't done anything to the back. I'll decide how I want to finish that later. I may paint a different design on the other side, but I've let it dry and re-sand it, with my little sanding pad. I always like to re-sand after doing some base coats like this, just so I have a real nice smooth finish. And now I want to do sort of a variegated background on this before the next step. So I've got 2 colors out here. I've got the original white that we used, which was the color Everlasting, and you can use any type of acrylic white, like the Americana Titanium White would work. And I've got a color which is a light gray value that is called Yesteryear in the chalky finish. But you could use, in Traditions, you could use probably the light gray value, or you could use something like slate gray in Americana. So, use what you have available if you don't have the chalky paints. And I'm using a smaller brush this time. I'm going to try this with just a number 12 flat, a 1/2 inch flat, something like that, because I want a little smaller pattern in this background. So I've, just wet my brush. I like to start with a damp brush, and I'm just going to pick up some of the white and start working here along the edge. And while that's wet, I'm going to pick up some of the gray. I'm going to use what's here on the lid so I'm not contaminating my jar. And I'm going to start working that into the wet white. I should put a little bit of this white into my lid, or you could put it on a palette. So I can wipe this off later with a paper towel. So I've got white and gray. And while this is wet, you're just going to keep going back and forth and picking up one color or the other and just softly blending those into each other with little crisscross strokes. And you'll get a nice variation of values by the two mixing together. I had originally painted this little bird design on some parchment paper that had a variegated look to it, so that's what I'm trying to replicate here, just kind of the small variegated pattern of some parchment paper. And so just continue working through your whole background like that. And if you want it lighter, use more white. And if you want it a little darker, you can use more of the gray color. So this goes fairly fast. You can see I'm already halfway done with the board. So there's my background, and I'm going to let this dry. And then we're going to do some image transfer to add some sheet music to the background. My surface is dry, and I've applied the pattern to the background. Okay, I want to soften the music notes, so we're going to dry brush some of the background colors over this. And I'm switching now to Traditions paints because we're going to paint the design in Traditions. And I'm going to try this big round stippling or dry brush. This is a Royal Sable Tech. And it's just a round with a bullet nose. It's good for stippling and dry brushing. So I'm going to use the same colors. We're going to use white and we're going to use a light gray. So I'm using titanium white, and I'm going to use the light gray value. And I just want to soften some of these down so they merge into the background a little bit more. We want them there, but not so prominent. So I'm just kind of doing what we did with the background before, but just coming over the corners of some of these to dry brush some whites and grays back over here. So I'm putting the paint on thin so that we can still see our music through it, but it's just toning it down. So I'm just kind of doing an overall dry brush right now. We can, once we get our design painted in, we might want to go back at that point and decide that some areas need to be toned down even a little bit more, that you want to lose the notes just a little bit more, but we can fine-tune that later after the color's all in. So hopefully you can see from this side where we're getting softer to this side that's still the sharper black and white. I see a little area up here that I think's gotten a little too gray, so brush a little bit of white back over top of that. Okay, the next step is going to be to, after your dry brushing on the music notes dries, I want you to base your bird in white and make sure your tracing's down so you can see it, so you have just a little indication where the wing is. And we'll start on him next. Okay, our little bird is based with white, and now we're going to add some color to him. I'm going to use Naphthol Red, which is a bright red, so use any bright red of your choice. And we're going to use a little yellow oxide, which is kind of a golden yellow, and some white. And possibly a little bit of burnt umber or raw umber, just a dark brown that we'll use for a little bit of shading. So I'm just going to use a little angle brush. This is like a 3/8 inch, so you can use that, or a 1/2 inch would work. And I just want to get some color on him. So I'm going to pick up, just dampen my brush a little bit, and pick a little bit of our red up and start brushing that color over his body. Here on the edges where I want to keep a nice crisp edge, I just work on the chisel edge of my brush just to drag along there to keep a nice even line. And I'll come back and work in from there and fill it in. I'm going to work around the wing to start with and keep the wing open for the moment. And on this front edge, I'll just keep that kind of a dry brush so that we don't have a hard line where that wing starts and stops when we get into it. And as I'm working along the edge of that wing, I'm going to come back and pick up a little bit of raw umber. And while that paint is wet, just start blending that into it a little bit to start some shading. So I'm just working in little short overlapping strokes. So that kind of blends the paint into each other, the two colors, as I work. Then as we come back here to his tail, just go back to your just plain red. Went outside of my line a little bit right there, so I'm gonna try to clean that up. It's getting pretty dry in here under these lights. So this first layer is going to be kind of choppy, but don't worry about that. We'll put a second layer over it and do some dry brushing so it'll start smoothing out. And we want him to have a little bit of a dry brush look, anyway. As you're coming here into the wing, I want a little bit of a golden glow to come in under that, so I'm going to add a little bit of yellows into that red paint. And that was the yellow oxide that I'm using. So if you're working in Americana, you could use something like, say, mustard seed or marigold would work. Any of those warm golden yellows. And we can brush a little bit of that yellow into his face. And maybe a little bit out here on his tail. Just places where we're going to start highlighting later, so they'll have nice warm undertones. And I'm going to switch to a smaller, round brush and go ahead and paint in his beak. And I'm going to paint that in with this yellow oxide color. I'm just color booking that in. And we're going to paint in his little legs down here. I'm going to go back and work on him. He feels fairly dry. I'm just going to, again, start adding another layer of red. And I want his head lighter, so I'm going to start adding in some of the yellow ochre and a touch of white to start lightening his head. And I'm just lightly brushing the surface to blend those colors. I don't want to work too hard. You want to make sure your undercoat is dry, otherwise it might start lifting in spots. But if you'll notice, I'm always trying to keep the long toe of my brush where I had that color on towards the center here. So I keep flipping the brush around and working so that I can keep that light color more concentrated in the center. And there's more of the red out here on the heel of my brush to fill in the brighter color. In the same way, we can pick up a little bit of the browns again and start working a little more of that around his wings, or his wing. We don't have multiples on this side. Just reinforcing that shadow around his wing just a little bit. And I'm not really cleaning my brush out in between as I'm doing this. I'm just wiping it off a little bit because there's not much paint by the time I've painted in the area. And I like the way the colors sort of blend with each other when you work with a dirty brush. So again, out here on the tail, we're going to pick up a little bit of the yellow. And it's again on the long tip of my brush, so I'm pointing that in the direction where I want the light value to be. And then I'm going to pick up again a little bit of the white on the tip and work that right in over top. And this is just lightly blended. It's not a perfectly even value. We're going to do the same thing here on the wing. We're going to start with some red here at the front where it goes into his chest. And then as we come back to the end where we want it to be lighter, we're going to add some of the golden yellow oxide. And then pick up a little bit of the white and brush that in there. So our bird's pretty well blocked in. You know, all we need to now do to him is, you know, just some dry brushing to add some stronger white highlights. And we'll do a little bit of work on his legs to give them a little more definition. So I'm going to, I picked up a little bit of raw umber on the tip of my angle brush, and I'm just going to come in here and drag that under his body to put in a little shadow. And you can put some here down here on the lower part of his feet. And you can add a touch of red to that also, just to warm it up, and maybe we'll float a little bit here on the back. Now on his beak we can do just a little bit of shading on that also. I'll do a little bit of raw umber and some of the red mixed in it, and just come here and float a little bit on the bottom of his beak. Go there in the middle a little bit. Here and reinforce that shading under his body a little on the legs. I'm going to use a little flat brush. This is number 4, and I want to pull some dry brushing on his tail and wing. So I don't want to use any water in this brush. I'm not dampening it at all. I'm just putting some white paint on it. I'm going to brush a little of the excess off on a paper towel. And I'm just going to just lightly pull some sort of indications of feathers, I guess. These are very impressionistic. They're not... But you can see a little indication of some sort of stripy things going on here. Load the brush with a little more, and we're going to do the same thing here on the tail. So I'm pushing down at the start and then kind of lifting so it gets more paint here on the edge and fades out to next to nothing when I lift. Just reinforce that a little bit here and there. Then using a round dry brush, this is one of the round sort of natural hairs with the rounded tip. I'm going to do the same thing on the face, but because the face is round, we want to do this in... Can't just pull stripes. I'm going to start here in the middle. I don't have much paint on this brush, and starting out very lightly to see where I'm at. I'm just going in a circle. I just want to highlight his head a little bit. Once you see how much paint's on your brush, you can decide how hard you need to push. So I had very little, so I'm scrubbing pretty good now. You can dry brush a little bit more on his tail and wing if you want to soften anything. So now on the little bird, we want to put in an eye and, so we'll start again with the yellow oxide, and we're going to do a little dot here. And I usually try to keep it, you don't want to get it too high. It's kind of going to be in here in line with the beak. So we're just going to come back in maybe 1/4 of an inch from the edge. And I'm going to draw a little circle of gold. And we'll let that dry, and then we'll go back and put the black pupil in that and a little highlight. While we're waiting for that to dry, I want you to go through and you can fill in your lettering. Let's get a coat on that. And I'm going to use this little flat, this is a number 2 flat brush, and I'd like the base coat of these colors to be kind of a honey color, honey gold. So I'm going to use some of the yellow oxide and some white mixed in that. We're going to paint these letters eventually red, but I want a little glow of yellow shining out along the edges. So we're just going to go, and you can see this is just kind of a real soft light honey color. So it's the yellow oxide with a little white just brush mixed in. And I just brush mix a little as I go. You don't have to worry about it all being exactly the same color. Just something close is good enough. As I'm working, I keep my paints on a wet palette, and these have been on here for several days because I just keep using the same palette over and over. But I don't know if you can notice, if you're working on a wax palette, just putting paint out as you need it, your paint might have a little different consistency because, the wet palette has a soaking wet sponge underneath the palette paper. Your paints do tend to absorb more water as they've been sitting there. So as you can probably tell, my paint's pretty liquid. So if you're working with bottled acrylics that you're putting out on a wax palette, you may need to add a little water to yours. And once you get one coat done, if you feel like you need a second coat, to have a more even tone, that's okay. You can go back and repaint those. I think I'm okay with just one coat. As I said, this is only going to peek out around the edges of the red paint when we put that on. And some of these letters are going to go right out over top of the sheet music that we put on in the background. So just paint right over top of those little notes. That adds to the effect of this being the sheet music being behind our design as the background. So while that's drying, we'll go back, we'll do it a little bit more on our design, and we're going to start working on our, shafts of wheat, or weeds, whatever you want to call these back here. And I'm going to use a round brush, and we're going to pull these in various colors from the raw umber up to the golden oxide. And I'm going to start with the darkest color. I usually tend to try to start with those first, so they're sort of in the background. So I'm just going to mix a little water with my raw umber paint. Get it sort of inky. Again, you can add a touch of the red into that if you want more of a burnt umber color. And I'm going to start pulling in some lines for all these little twigs. So this is kind of a knot in the center. And then I'm going to start, these work out in sort of a fan shape on either side. So I'm starting at the center, pushing down, I'm pulling, and as I get out to the end, I'm lifting up so that these trail off. And you can vary the length a little bit. These will be sort of our background shadow twigs. Do a little short one down that hangs over the and then you're going to reverse and do the same on the other side. So I'm going to turn over because I find it easier because I'm right-handed to pull from left to right. So again, if it gets too dry, just add some water again to your mix. So that's kind of our general shape. We've got this kind of fanned out shape going on. And next I'm going to switch down and go to a little brighter color. So this time I'm going to use some raw sienna, which is similar to the golden oxide, just a little darker. It'll add some more of the golden tones. And again, we're just doing the same thing, pulling from the center out. Stroke some over your little knot in the middle. And then we're going to switch around. I can't pull towards myself. So find out the direction that's most comfortable for you to pull these quick strokes, because you don't want to sit and just draw them. You really want to be more spontaneous and let them just happen by pulling out quickly. So see, we're starting to fill in pretty good. And then just drop down and add a few of the yellow oxide. These will be the brightest. And they won't be much different from the raw sienna, but they'll just be a little yellower. So while those are drying, let's go ahead and go back to our lettering, and we're going to add some red to that. So I'm just picking up, again, using this round brush, and I'm picking up the naphtha red with some water in it. And I'm going to come along and draw over these letters, but I don't want this line to be as wide as that yellow line is. I want that yellow just to show out on either edge. So I'm just pushing down and pulling. So you've got the red in the center, and you've got a little bit of a golden glow behind it. So you might need to take a couple different strokes to fill these in, but we're just going to go back over all these with the red. And don't stress if these aren't perfectly even. I go on and off the edge. Some spots I have more yellow showing. Some places the red actually goes right out to the edge. This is just an about right. You just want the overall effect of a little bit of yellow peeking out. It doesn't have to be a perfect outline. So this is all starting to come together. So let's go back and do some more shading on our shaft of wheat. I want it darker here on each side of the knot, and we need to add some shading to the knot. So we're going to use our dark brown, the raw umber, and I'm just going to come in and float some of that color on each side. And this is very wet float. It's just going to walk it out, which means I'm laying it down and I'm moving out maybe 1/4 of an inch and going again, and it's wet enough that it sort of bleeds together, but I can spread that shaded area out. And if you want to pull some just with the chisel edge of your brush, you can do that. I'm going to come down here along the bottom edge of this knot. You can tuck a little bit here underneath the bird's feet. Put a little shadow under there. And we're going to do along this side. And like I said, my floats are pretty wet. It's almost just short of puddling the paint. Walk that out and then just streak a few out through there. And we'll jump around while things are drying. So we're going to go back to the letters and do some shading on these to make them look a little bit more dimensional. So I'm going to float, we used gray on our background, and I'm going to float a gray shadow down the right side of each letter. Let's go to the medium, Traditions medium gray mix. I'm just going to come down and float to the right and bottom of each letter on the background. We're not on the letter, we're just slightly below it. So this is sort of like a little cast shadow. And we don't have really any light source to speak of in this painting, so we're just taking the liberty of doing them on the right side. A little too much on this one. Soften that back out again. Don't forget to do the insides of these open letters. You may need to go over this a couple times. Once it dries, sometimes they soften down and they're not as, you think they're very distinctive, but after they dry, they just soften into the background a little bit. With something like the top of this bee, I'm just trailing that off as it starts curving down to the front of the bee, because we want the shadows to be under and to the right. I'm just reloading my brush as the paint starts feeling like it's getting too sheer. Once you've done it all, if you see some spots that you feel like needs a second coat, just go back and work those areas. You don't have to do all of it. Some of it I'm seeing just has lightened up a little more. You just want that good contrast for a dimensional look. Or if you've missed a spot like I did here under the arm of the T, let's go back and add another layer on the shading on the twigs. I'm just going to repeat what I did the first time, just floating in a wash of raw umber here at the center to kind of anchor that. To highlight that knot, we could just stroke in a few little streaks of white along sort of towards the top, just to give that a little bit of a highlight. Let's finish our little bird's eye. We're not using much black in this picture, but we'll put a little black pupil in his eye. And it's really going to cover almost all of the yellow. You just want a little, it's kind of like the letters, you just want a little yellow peeking around the edge. And you can do just a tiny dot for a little nostril on his beak. I'm going to switch to a fine liner brush. This is a 20-aught. It's maybe not quite a half-inch long. I don't like real short liners, but I don't like real long ones either. And we're going to do some little strokey things through the vines to give them more texture. So we can do some with, let's do some with black. These are just going to be little squiggly vines. So I'm just working up on the tip of my brush and just meandering around, trying to get those little tendrils. And these are very fine. You don't want heavy things. So work up on the tip of your brush and keep your paint very thin so that it just comes off like ink. You can go back and add some of those in, some of the raw sienna too, just to break things up a little bit. Okay, and now we're going to add some berries, and I a lot of times will do dots with the tip of a rounder liner brush, but if you'd rather do it with a stylus, you know, feel free to do that. We're going to just vary these colors also. We're going to do some in the raw umber. I'm just getting some paint on my brush and just gonna dot some in clusters. You can do some single ones, but you just want them to be sort of random. And some can be like little clusters at the end of their wheat or some kind of little seed pod, but sometimes you'll see ones that have little clusters of seeds at the end. But I like these little ones at the ends where we cluster a whole group of them together. Kind of gives some definition to the ends of our little spray of stems. So after you do the dark brown ones, go back and add some gold, and we're going to add some red. So first I'm going to do the raw sienna ones. And you can go over some of these on the ends just to, again, give them some value. It gives them a little more dimension. We want a little pop of color, so we'll add some red ones. Again, it carries the red from our bird and the lettering out into your design, so your eye moves through things. Turn it around so I don't stick my hands in the wet dots on the other side. So you just work till you kind of look at it and you feel like you've got a nice balance of colors. We'll do one more little thing to our letters and add a highlight of white to the side of them. And I'm just going to very lightly stroke some white along the top edges. This is going to be opposite our shadows. Or maybe I should say kind of adjacent to the shadows. A little too much on that one. Just wet it and blot it off. Put a little highlight dot in the bird's eye. Keep this very tiny. And now I think, looking at the bird again, I think I'd like to go back and add just a little touch of yellow to him. So I'm going to use that little number 4 flat and put a little bit of the yellow oxide on it and just float or dry brush a little bit of this yellow kind of at the bottom of his wings and the bottom of his tail. Just dry brush a little bit of that over the back of his cheek. Repeats that color a little more. Maybe add a little sharper highlight of the white on top of his cheek. I don't want to overdo this. I'm wiping most of it out on a paper towel. Don't want to get a glob. Even using the teeny little number 2 flat, maybe drag just a little bit here along the front of his feet and legs. It's just white that I'm just adding a little bit more of a highlight and a little here on the front of his beak. We could do some very fine outlining of black. I'm getting my paint down to a very inky consistency. Make sure you don't have any drops of water on the ferrule that'll run down. And I'm going to just very lightly outline his beak. This isn't a real solid outline, just little hit and miss here just to define that a little bit more. And you can do that all the way around his body if you want, but again, keep it very, very fine and very sketchy. I have hardly any paint coming off. And I like lining to go on and off the edge. I don't want it to be just perfectly centered on that edge. It's more like sketch lines. Do a little bit around his wing. And just very lightly around his feet. I think I'm gonna add a few more little curly cues in here that do some that are just slightly heavier. Make sure your dots are dry so that you don't run your finger through them. And the last thing I think before we finish it up is I'm going to add a little bit of color to some of these outer edges just to frame this in. And I'm using this big number 20 round Sable-Tech brush. So again, it's a dry brush or stippler. And I'm going to pick up a little bit of this raw sienna. That's our honey brown color. And I'm brushing that off so I don't have much. And I just want to come along and just scrub a little bit of this along the edges, kind of the antique. Some of these edges are just a bit. And bring it in on some of this music. You don't want very much paint on your brush. This is just kind of rouging. And you could also pick up just a tiny bit of the red and be sure you work most of that out of your brush, and again just hit some of these areas where you added the gold and it'll just give it more of a blush color. If you want your edges darker, you know, like antiqued, you could always add a little bit of the raw umber. I'll try it in a couple spots. Maybe work a little bit of that in through your little twigs. Anything else you want to add? You could add some little white specks if you want some white berries, or add some little dots on your berries to, you know, create little highlights. I mean, we could go in and just hit a couple here and there to add a little spark of light. You don't have to do all of them, just here and there. So at this point, I think we're finished, and you can sign your name and apply, I would say, 2 to 3 coats of, I like a matte varnish, but if you like a semi-gloss or a gloss, that's fine. I'm just prefer the look of a matte that doesn't have much shine. And I'm thinking I would paint the edges of the board. You know, pick something that appeals to you, but you could do it in red to match the bird, or you could do it in the gray, or even, you know, one of the, like raw sienna, something like that would be nice. So if you want to finish off that with a contrasting color, you can do that. So I hope you like this project, and we'll come back with another one.